Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Miller. I'm with the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs. My role here predominantly is to coordinate our community response to domestic violence, which includes coordinating our men's nonviolence program, coordinating all of our work around criminal justice reform, and then training both of those responses around the country and world. So welcome. And what we've decided to do in this overview is take you through a little bit about how this model came to be, and talk about some of the work that was done that led to it, and then talk about what the model is, and move into then what a coordinated community response is and how the men's program fits into that, and hopefully clear up some of the confusion that's out in some of the literature about these three different responses that were developed here in Duluth. So the first thing I just want to say is that the early organizers in Duluth, starting in 1980 and today, are organizing around the social problem of battering, and the definition is up on your screen. This is the type of domestic violence that we have organized around. Now we know that the crime of domestic violence can involve a lot of different things. It can involve a woman slapping her husband because he cheated on her and she found out. It can involve two brothers who were fighting over who gets to use the car today. A subset of the crime of domestic violence is battering. And these are the folks that pose the most ongoing threat and danger to the community and to the families that they live with. So all of what we're going to talk about today is focused around this particular subset of the crime of domestic violence. So the origins of the Duluth model, you know, at the time we organized this in the 1980s, it was really up to women to hold the men accountable. Law enforcement had complete discretion to mediate, separate, but there was no mandatory arrest. At the time, there were states that had passed mandatory arrest provisions, but there had been no police departments. It was largely ignored, and no police departments had really taken that on and made a policy for their law enforcement. So part of the DAP's understanding and philosophy at the time was that the state really needs to protect its citizens. And to do that would have to create a tremendous change in the way that the whole criminal justice system would respond. If they now were responsible for protecting her, for example, for being beaten, then they'd have to change their policies, their practices, their standard operating procedures in order to take this crime up in a very different way than they had up to this point. So the organizers at the time, Ellen Pence being the main one, who many of you may know, realized that we need to build trust and relationship with these agencies. And because there had been so little and almost no work done around this at the time, there was no real manual for this. They took almost a year to really follow the law enforcement around and do ride-alongs. They looked at their policies. They did everything they could without judgment to understand, starting with law enforcement, what it's like to be a cop. What do they see when they go to these calls to 911 for domestic violence? How do they respond? And really took time to learn and gain credibility from the agencies because of that investment. The police were the first agency that DIP coordinated with, but it was clear from law enforcement that if we're going to change how we do things and we take up this crime and we're going to spend the time in a different way than we have been, then we want all the agencies to likewise change the way that they respond, which was the goal of the DEIP at the time anyway. But it was a clear investment that law enforcement will invest if they invest. And they also knew that there was no one agency that could solve this problem. So part of the idea is that each of these agencies have an effect on men who batter and have an effect on the victims. And as we build from 911 to the jail to law enforcement to courts to prosecution to probation, we have to build it in a way that they're all linked up and they all have consistent ways of thinking about this particular crime and what causes it, so that the interventions can match. In other words, you don't want law enforcement thinking it's a relationship problem, or judges thinking it's a relationship problem, prosecutors thinking it's an individual problem with the guy who's battering, because it creates different interventions. So they had to be linked. So in 1981, the chief of police in Duluth agreed to a study brought by the DEIP. So what they said is the first third of the patrol officers are going to be given a mandatory arrest policy, a brand new policy that when they go to domestic and they have visible signs of injury and probable cause, that they will make an arrest and they will follow a certain set of guidelines in order to what evidence they collect, what questions they ask. And with that, the prosecutors agreed to diligently, not in every case obviously, but diligently prosecute these cases in a way that they had not in the past. The second third of officers were given the existing policy, which gave them complete discretion to arrest, mediate, or separate. And the last third of officers were encouraged but not required to arrest, and had to write a report regardless, detailing their decision. What the chief found was a dramatic difference in both the evidence that was being collected in the mandatory arrest set of officers and the difference in recidivism. So, you know, what they found was that mandatory arrest impacted these guys' decision to commit a new act of violence. That separation and mediation was inadequate in these domestic violence cases. That had the highest amount of recidivism is the cases that were mediated or separated. And then there was a marked increase in the number of white men getting arrested. So what they noticed, and what they didn't anticipate in their results, was that when the mandatory arrest policy went into place, there was a lot of men of color, mostly Native and African American, that were getting arrested for these crimes, but white men were not. And when the mandatory arrest policy went in, there were a lot more white men getting arrested. So the police chief, given the results, he put this first-time policy for mandatory arrest for all officers, which most all states have now taken on. So this Duluth model idea wasn't a notion at the time that they were doing the study, but what they came to realize is that there's a way to organize this across these agencies that that situates this particular crime within a social context. So, this idea that Duluth model is an organizing method that prioritizes victim safety and offender accountability. So the priority is victim safety. So if we're going to develop an intervention, regardless if it's a men's program or it's a particular police intervention, victim safety has to be the priority. Offender accountability has to come second. And we understand that this happens within a social context because it's a social problem. And then this model will help build these interventions in systems that are aligned with victims. So one of the things that's distinguished Duluth over the years and the interventions that we've developed is that when we put together an idea, it could be something as simple as a card that's given out by police, or it could be something as involved as developing a supplement to our men's nonviolence curriculum for working with evangelical men. We sit down in focus groups with women and ask them about what their experience is regarding the particular issue at hand. We want to develop whatever our interventions with them and for them. Now, if you just think about the further you are if you have a CCR in your community, the further you are from the voices of victims, the more likely you are to create interventions that have unintended consequences. The closer you are aligned with victims and the advocates that represent them, the less likely that that's going to happen. So what we did is we had these clearly identified, largely shared assumptions across agencies that that were adopted. So if we're going to develop any intervention, they have to kind of follow this shared understanding. That we empirically test them. So once we put the policy into place, we have a way of tracking and monitoring to see, did the intervention that we've designed have the desired effect? If it didn't, then what do we need to do to reevaluate it? And I'll give you an early example. When we put the mandatory arrest policy into place, an unanticipated, unintended consequence was that a lot of women started getting arrested for fighting back against the man who was beating her. And so they went back to the table at the St. Louis County Sheriff's Department to start and developed a policy around self-defense and predominant aggressor in order to take up that particular type of violence, resistive violence, in a way that either would not end up in arrest, or if it did end up in arrest because it was illegal violence, that the prosecutor would then have a different way of thinking about what justice would be in that particular case because they have the evidence to support it. And then well-defined methods of interagency cooperation guided by the advocacy program. So this is a particularly important one, and one that we've seen have some detrimental effect to the CCR when criminal justice folks end up taking over the coordination effort in the CCR. What tends to happen, it isn't a given, but what tends to happen is that the criminal justice system ends up fixing problems they have versus the problems that the women are having. So if you know, I'll give an example. There was a group of judges who, after mandatory arrest got put into place, their dockets got jammed full. And so their goal was to clear the dockets. So they developed a deferral program for first-time offenders. But what they had to do is plead not guilty at arraignment. Well, what happened was that many of the women ended up pleading guilty at arraignment, as many women often do, because they need to get home to their kids. They feel differently about the violence that they used because it was in defense of themselves. So they ended up pleading guilty. The men pled not guilty. The men ended up being in the deferral program, and the women were all found, you know, a lot of women were found were the ones being guilty in supervised reprobation. So it had the opposite effect of what the intent was, but because they didn't line it up with advocates and they didn't line it up with women who were being abused in that particular community, it had an unintended consequence. When advocates are the one coordinating it, we're the ones whose job we're organized to align ourselves and be able to know and speak on the experience of the people we're trying to serve. If they're not included, things can happen that can make it worse for those you're trying to improve your community for. All right, so the Duluth Model. Advocacy agencies coordinate the work of the CCR. We talked about that. Victims and their experience are integral in the designing and advising of the work of the CCR. I can tell you that as long as I have done this, and we've come up with a draft, I'll give you just a quick example of a card that we were handing out, that law enforcement would hand out at the point of arrest to the victim. And we thought we had this thing about domestic abuse no contact orders all fleshed out, and we gave it to a focus group of women, and they completely rewrote it and made it 10 times better than we could have ever done. And we just learned so much from them about what they pay attention to, what words mean something, what words don't, how long it had to be. We're designing that card for them. To not include them in the development of it would have been a mistake, and probably it resulted in it being ignored by victims once they received it. Interventions need to enhance and be linked to the work of the next agency prosecuting the case. So the Duluth model says that when you've got a particular agency in a particular system, that is charged with a particular task. So let's just take law enforcement. They're to go to the scene and they're to collect evidence, determine if probable cause exists. If it exists, make an arrest. Write a report, turn it in. If that report isn't written in a way that advocates have a way of determining the level of risk she's at, if the report isn't written in a way that helps prosecutors do the job that they're doing, then you're going to lose your coordination, right? Because every step of that in point of case processing should enhance the next practitioner's ability to do their job. And to do that, you have to have partnerships with each of the agencies to help design what that's going to look like. Because we as advocates, we know our work with victims and offenders, if that's the work that you do. What we don't know is the work of a prosecutor, because that's not who we are. So we need to sit down with them and say, this is what we've learned. These are the gaps that we've found. How is it that we can take the work that you do as a prosecutor, combine it with what we understand the victims are experiencing or the offenders are slipping through the cracks, and solve that particular problem together. Each intervention needs to balance prioritizing victim safety and offender accountability with improving the work experience of the practitioner. Okay, so you cannot, well, you can, but the Duluth model would say, if you go into an agency and with a great idea about how to solve a particular gap in your system, but it's going to cost them 10% more time to do it, the likelihood that that's going to be a sustainable practice, one that gets implemented and continued to be accomplished, is unlikely. So we've always found a way to meet the goal of improved safety for victims, offender accountability, and also improve the work experience of the practitioner. And a lot of times that's time. So I was in a community out west, and the struggle was around law enforcement doing three-finger reports. In other words, they were 2 to 3 sentences long, and then they get forwarded immediately to an investigator who would have to do all the work and all the follow-up, when the best evidence really is at the scene. So to solve that particular problem, the officer said, we're going to have to spend more time, and I don't want to spend more. I don't have time to spend at the scene. When we showed them the amount of cases that were actually being followed up on, so they're going to spend time. They're going to go to that scene. They're going to talk to him. They're going to talk to her. They're going to write something down. They're going to submit a report. That's time. And that time, for the most part, was wasted, because a lot of those cases just ended up disappearing because there wasn't sufficient for follow-up for the investigator. So it may have taken them more time, but the investment of time resulted in many more of these cases being prosecuted. So it's how efficient is the time that you're spending. So thinking through with these different practitioners about, all right, so we understand that we can't ask you to double your workload because we have this particular problem. How is it that we can make your job easier and better? What can we do to produce for you that you don't have now that would help you do your work in a more efficient, productive manner? Risk information must be collected, analyzed, and distributed at the outset of the case. I can't tell you how many places that I go, and they burden the men's program at the end after conviction with doing the first risk assessment on the guy. At that point, really, what's the purpose? I mean, it could be a year down the line before the guy gets convicted, and now you're doing your first risk evaluation on how dangerous he is, and they put it on the men's program. That should be done right after the arrest and prior to arraignment, so that every intervener, from the judge, the pretrial release agents, and the prosecutor, has a set of risk factors for that particular case, and that they're all making decisions based on the best information available at that time for the risk that this individual poses. And then that information follows him wherever he goes through the process. So when he, if he pleads guilty and he goes to probation for a pre-sentence investigation, there's the risk information. And by that time, it might have been added to, given a reoffense, a drinking violation on his conditions of release. Now you have more information. And then practitioners work together in a strategic manner to resolve problems. And most of this work is done in small groups because you don't, I can't tell you how many times I've been to a community and I've interviewed law enforcement and I've asked them, how is prosecution in your community? And they say things like, well, there used to be a time when we prosecuted cases in our community, and then I go to the prosecutor and I ask them, how is law enforcement investigation in your community? And they say, well, there used to be a time when we investigated crime, but I guess we don't do that anymore. So you just have these ideas that they have of each other, and they've got historical grudges that can be held. Not everybody works together well, and that's okay. When you've got advocates coordinating the effort, I sit down with one agency, I sit down with another agency, I sit down with another agency, and I hear what their struggles are in processing these cases. And you then get, you have a great deal of information about what the gaps might be and how to solve them. And then you go back to that first agency and say, okay, so if you can collect this information, the prosecutors are saying it's much more likely that they can move forward on these cases if they have this, if you're interviewing all witnesses at the scene, not just the ones involved in the violent act. Those kinds of things. So when we've organized in Duluth, and we've done it a few times where we've brought everybody together, we tend, if anything gets done, it gets done extremely slow. Advocates' voices get marginalized, which means that better women's voices get marginalized, and old grudges come out, and it reduces the productivity of the work. So most of the work that we do is in small meetings with individual practitioners. Okay, so it provides us this approach that I think we've covered all. We've covered all of this. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. All right, so we did a project in Duluth with the Blueprint for Safety, which many of you may have heard of. The federal OVW chose 3 sites, Memphis, New Orleans, and Duluth, to try to replicate the work that was done in St. Paul, Minnesota on what is called the Blueprint for Safety. Now, we had a set of principles that guided all of our work. In other words, when we develop an intervention, the intervention could not be in conflict with any of the principles that we held as a CCR, not the DEIP, but everybody. And when we took on the Blueprint for Safety, which really resulted in us either rewriting or writing new policy for every single domestic violence policy for every single criminal justice agency over 3 years. These are the principles that all of those interventions that we developed had to be in concert with. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I can direct you to Praxis International's website, and they have a good detailed explanation of what each of these principles mean, and how you need to think about them when developing system interventions across your CCR. There are, along with the principles, there's a shared understanding that each agency needs to take on. That there's 3 kinds of violence. There's battering, there's resistive, and there's non-battering. And we do our best, given what we produce, especially at the point of law enforcement investigation, to figure out which one of these that we have. Because it means it tells us something about the ongoing risk. It tells us which cases to put our energy into and which cases may need less. The power of the state should be restricted to the controlling the legal activity of the offender, so we're not going to be ordering a victim of domestic violence to do things because they're a victim. We're going to be managing the person who's the offender, and offer opportunities for victims to choose from. But we're not going to remove her autonomy as the person who's been battering her has done, and tell her what she needs to do. Victims are rarely free to cooperate with the system to hold offenders accountable. Now you think, okay, we all know that, but you can go through criminal justice agencies, even advocacy agencies, and start seeing where that starts getting violated, with frustration over the fact that I did this for the victim and the victim didn't show up. Or I'm going to put the victim in jail because I need her for this particular trial. Those kinds of things, those practices violate the shared understanding that she's rarely free. So if she's rarely free to cooperate, then how are we going to design it? What are we going to produce that's going to make it us able to process the case in a way that doesn't make it worse for her? Account for power differences between the victim and the offender. This is huge. When somebody is being battered, a power difference gets created between those two. And that power difference has to be accounted for in all the interventions that, especially the ones that involved her. So in law enforcement, when they go to the scene, and for example, the Duluth Police Department, an officer is going to take the offender into one room, and another officer is going to take the victim into another room. And they're going to interview her outside of earshot of him, because you're not going to get good evidence standing her right next to him. And the reason you're not going to get a good evidence is because there's a power imbalance that he's established over her. In the men's program, we're not going to teach him skills, relationship skills, and send him home to try them out with her, right? When we're very clear on that with us, don't send him home trying new stuff with me, because A, he doesn't do it well, and B, if I don't respond the way he thinks I'm supposed to because he doesn't do anything wrong, then it makes it worse for me. So each agency that's part of the CCR needs to have ways of filtering their interventions, what they do, what their practices, understanding that there's this power imbalance that has been created, and how are we going to account for it. And that batterers are responsible for stopping their violence. It isn't, we're not battering somebody because she pissed him off. You can get angry, you can get all kinds of things, but when you beat somebody into submission with the intent to dominate them, then that's your deal. This is not a relationship problem. It's one that is it needs to be accounted for by the person executing the violence. So I'm just going to take a quick break and see if there's any questions that have come up at this point, or okay, so I guess there's a PDF that's online under handouts that describes the Duluth model distinguished from the coordinated community response and the different agencies, and which it kind of encapsulates what I've been talking about as far as what the Duluth model directs versus the coordinated community response.
So one of the questions that we have here is there a program to help female victims get an easy charge off their record for fighting back? For example, if the year of the charge was, many years back. I think it's a bit of an expungement question, which is a legal question, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about how we intervene and organize when a victim becomes a defendant. And if we can talk about that later, you can just say that, but that's what the question's related to.
Yeah, I don't know of a program. I mean, each state has different expungement rules and what those are. And I think Minnesota has just passed some rules here about working through that process. What I can say is that a lot of women end up with convictions that wouldn't if there were good self-defense assessments done at the scene, and predominant aggressor assessments. If not self-defense, then who's the predominant aggressor? You dramatically will reduce the amount of women getting arrested and convicted, needing expungements if you deal with that at the scene. So if you, we'll provide a link to the Crossroads program, which is a prosecution policy for our city attorney's office. That policy deals with misdemeanor arrests for women who've committed illegal violence in a domestic relationship. And it helps guide prosecutors through a conversation about how you treat similar crimes dissimilarly and how you determine justice. And it's a policy that's been, it was the first one that was developed in the country, and it's been used and practiced here since the mid-90s. And it really is helped a great deal of women not end up with convictions for domestic assault.
So Scott, there's a follow-up to that, and part of the follow-up is that you can design a policy, a protocol, say in a police department, and but how do you design and integrate it so there's accountability, so it actually happens, it actually gets followed through? Can you say a little bit about that?
Right. So that's a great question, actually, because one of the things that you have to do, and I think we're going to get into this in the CCR conversation, is that when you design any intervention, there has to be a way to monitor and track what you've done. And so the MOU that we have with the police department is that we have an advocate here, that works at the DEIP, who every morning has clearance. She alone has the clearance. I, as her supervisor, do not. She goes into the police department and downloads all the previous night's arrests, previous day's arrest for domestic assault. And then she does a risk analysis on ODARE. She pulls all past police reports, domestic police reports. She pulls all past order for protection affidavits. She does a Minnesota criminal history check. If the individual, if there's any indication the individual was living in another state, then she makes a request for a national background check. And all of that goes into a file prior to and to the prosecutor, to probation, and the risk sheet alone goes to the judge. This is prior to arraignment, which for in custodies, which starts at 11 o'clock each morning. So everybody now is working off of that subset of information. And what we tell officers is there's no report that you produce in any crime that will be more scrutinized than a domestic violence report. By the time that guy gets arraigned at 11 o'clock, 2 advocates will have read that report. A domestic violence investigator, Pat, our DEIP advocate who goes in and puts the files together, and a supervisor. So, quick math, that's 5 or 6 people who are going to read that report before the guy gets arraigned the next morning. And one of the advocates is reading that report, to your question, for adherence to the policy, as is the investigator. So they're both looking for, are they following the procedure? Did they ask the risk questions? Were there witnesses that weren't interviewed? Were there enhancements that were missed? Those kinds of things. So if things are missed, then the advocate reading that report forwards that information to their lieutenant, who then sends it down to the sergeant, who talks to the patrol officer. Obviously, we as advocates, we don't supervise patrol, but we let the department know when there's an officer who doesn't follow procedure. The other thing we do is that we have a domestic abuse information network. It's a database that we've created, and we get all the police reports, we get all the court dockets, we get all every decision that ends up being made that's documented in court we put in this database. So we can tell you by officer in the Duluth Police Department what the percentage of cases they've asked all the risk questions. And we can produce that report for the command staff on a quarterly or half-year basis so that they can use that as a supervisory tool to improve their officers' response. So, you know, one of the things Ellen, who is a mentor of mine, taught me early when I started doing this work is that you need to be able to, as you design interventions, you're simultaneously designing the way that you're going to monitor them, because it is that critical. If you don't, it is likely that whatever you design is going to evaporate. And I'll give you an example. We had a deputy chief in Duluth, who's retired now, who called me one day and he said, "Scott, you don't have anybody reading police reports over there at the DEIP." And I said, "How do you know?" You know, I was kind of surprised. I thought maybe he knew the person who had left for another job. And he said, "Because I just took a few domestic reports and I read them, and there's a lot of stuff slipping, and we haven't heard from you." And there is, right? The sergeants read those reports, they supervise those things, but they're looking for all kinds of things, not just adherence to this particular policy. And so we provide that for them, and what they give us is access to the information. So, yeah. So let's move on and keep your questions coming. The coordinated community response, I'm sure you've read this slide already, it's institutionalizing practices and procedure with centralized victim safety. So, in other words, when we first started doing this work in Duluth, if you look back at some of the early interventions, it was agreements. We agree to prosecute this way. We agree to have a domestic violence response team in the police department. But those things can vanish when resources get low and somebody needs to get pulled off into the street, or we lose a prosecutor and now we're going to focus on the high, only the high risk cases because we just don't have the resources to take them all. Whatever that balance ends up being. And what we want to do is, once we know an intervention works, it might be a practice to start because we just don't know what the end result's going to be. But if it ends up being something that really ends up being a resource to the department, to advocates, to victims, and really helps other agencies do the jobs that they want to do, like our domestic violence response team, that now is in policy in the Duluth Police Department. So policy isn't something that you can change on a whim. Those things are institutionalized, and I can tell you that every officer who now works for the Duluth Police Department came into their job as a rookie under a domestic violence policy that was created between the police department and the DEIP and our local shelter advocates. So, yeah, the importance of institutionalizing whatever it is that works for sustainability reasons is huge. So the PDF that I referred to earlier is the detailed version of this particular slide. So the Duluth model is this philosophical way of approaching these cases. That model can be used in a hospital. It can be used in a criminal justice system. It can be used in a human service system. Any large systems, public systems, can be organized using that particular model because the model doesn't designate any particular type of intervention. So, for example, when we had folks from Russia over here talking about using our model over there, one of the things we learned is that they don't have probation. They don't even have an idea of what that is. So if anybody is going to follow up with somebody, it's going to be a law enforcement officer. And they thought, well, maybe because they don't have probation, they can't translate our response. Well, you can't translate our coordinated community response that involves probation because probation is an integral piece to that whole process. But you can use our approach, which means that you're going to start by sitting down with women and asking them, when you call for help, what happens? Who comes? What do they do? if you could redesign this, what would it look like? What does he get away with? How does he get away with it, right? And just really get a base of information about what this particular crime looks like in the community it's being done in. And once you understand that, you will really begin to see what the gaps are both for the system and for the victims. There, I was in another place, I think in the South, where they did a series of focus groups with law enforcement because they believed that they'd heard from women in the shelter that there was a problem with the police response, but it was more complaining about individual cops than it was about any kind of systemic issues. And so I directed them before I came out to do a CCR training that you really need to find out what the reality is first. So they did a whole series of focus groups with women and found out that the officers were coming in kind of like what I was talking about before, doing a very short report, interview, determining a probable cause. If probable cause exists, somebody goes, and then they left. And the victim had no idea what was going to happen next. Nobody talked to them. There was no information card. There was nothing that was linking them up. And so they didn't know when he was coming home. The jails weren't organized to make calls for when they release a victim or an offender. And they were just really lost in the process. And then many of the women got angry because they didn't want him hauled away. They didn't know what was going to happen. So just talking to the victims of this crime, you learn what the practice is. And then you sit down with the officers and you say, hey, can we do a ride-along? Can we watch what it is that you're up against when you go to the scene? Without judgment, we just want to learn what it is that you do and what you're up against. And then go to the command staff and say, this is what the problem is for the people you're trying to serve when you go to the scene, given the way that you're responding at this point. And are you open to us partnering with you and figuring out a way to solve this for those we're, again, trying to serve? So the Duluth Model approach can be used in any large system. The coordinated community response is actually what you end up organizing. And then as you can see at the bottom there, these are examples of Duluth's coordinated community response, the different interventions that we've created that all work in concert with each other and have the same kind of shared understanding, all adhere to the same principles that we talked about earlier in the slideshows. This is a slide from Praxis International's Safety and Accountability Audit Toolkit. So a lot of the thinking behind this, Ellen Pence generated when she was working here at the DEIP, and then formalized it in the late 90s when she started Praxis International as this particular tool to help people understand how agencies are workers within agencies are coordinated to do the jobs that they do. And typically if you find a gap in the response, it's in one of these 8 different pieces of the pie. So in Duluth, one of the things that they learned early on, and this has progressed and evolved over time, is that we weren't getting the kind of risk information that we needed to determine if the case was a case of battering, if the individual was a higher risk than say, another offender. And so we designed, we took the administrative practice piece, and what we did is the administrative practice is a way to standardize a particular intervention so that you're getting the same virtual result every time it gets implemented. And so what we asked the Duluth Police Department and the St. Louis County Sheriff's Department to do is ask a series of risk questions so that we can get context, we can get risk factors, we can make better determinations if the individual high risk, medium risk, or low, and we can also find out if there's other crimes that have been committed that she might not even know were a crime, like intimidating a witness. So these are the questions that are asked of every intimate partner, domestic violence victim, at the scene by an officer. That report, as I said, will be read by an advocate and will be and we document how often these officers ask these questions. If they don't, somebody will follow up with that particular victim and ask these questions. It's virtually our whole risk response that we've developed in Duluth is contingent on the answers that we get from this particular set of questions. And this just gives you some examples of what we've gotten by asking these questions. Whether there's a pattern, the perception of risk, firearms, forced sex, prior attempts to strangle, witness intimidation, offender's entitlement when he says things in the, when she tells us or tells the officer, he says that he likes all his women controlled. And because it's my money, you'll do what I say. You had my kid, then you're gonna have sex with me when I want. Those quotes of entitlement, as she talks about the worst thing he's ever done, you know, or the last thing he's ever done to her. Those descriptions get included in those reports, and then we know we're dealing with somebody who's using violence with an intent to dominate, which makes him a lot more dangerous. This gives you, I'm not going to go through this in detail, this gives you an idea that when we try to solve a problem within a CCR, one of the things that when I go to a community that often happens is that somebody identifies a problem and then immediately jumps to the solution without going through some steps that really help us understand what actually is the problem versus what we think it might be. Oftentimes we think it might be Jim. Jim is a intervener with a criminal justice agency who doesn't do his job. And if Jim just wasn't there, maybe we'd have a better response kind of thing. It's typically not about Jim. It's what allows for Jim to do that particular thing repeatedly in cases. And if he's not doing, and if he's the only one doing it, then it's probably just about him. And then really it's not part of the CCR. That's part of supervision, that's part of training, that kind of thing. But if Jim's doing something that all the other practitioners are doing on occasion, now you've got more of a systemic problem. So the problem typically comes to us from women who are victims or advocates working with the victims saying, this is what we keep experiencing with the criminal justice system with victims right now. We keep falling through the cracks, this kind of thing. And then we might do a focus group with women, depending on how big the problem is. We might do some observations, ride-alongs, sit-alongs, whatever it is that, whatever agency we're working with, and figure out if we can get a real scope of what, where the problem begins, how it gets executed, and what its impact is. So then once we have that, then we go to the decision makers for that particular agency, if that's what it is, or set of agencies, and ask them, for a proposal to change this. We don't know what it is yet, but we want to sit down with your officers and try and figure out the solution to this particular problem, and you have all this data to back it up. It's not, we can pull it from our DANE database and say this is a trend. We've pulled this problem for the last 3 years, and it actually is, we can find it back that far. It's happened in this many times, in this many cases, this percent of cases. And it's not just a story that we have. So we sit down with the work group meetings, we figure that stuff out, we draft a proposal, and then we check with people. We call practice, in the Twin Cities, or we call the Better Women's Justice Project and ask, has anybody else ever done anything like this? If we don't have to recreate the wheel, we don't want to, right? I mean, if somebody's already figured out a good way to do this, then let's find out from them what it is. And our national TA providers have a lot of information that they carry about different projects in different parts of the country. If there's a particular issue, we might bring an expert from around the country on that particular issue and have them to be, invite them to be part of the conversation and part of the solution. Once we get to the point where we're going to institute a change, then we get the sign-off from the command, whatever that is, we implement it, and then the training that we do is training on what we're going to implement. We're not training them on domestic violence. We're training them on what we're implementing and why it's important that they do this. And then we tell them this is how it'll be monitored, this is how it'll be tracked. And then we track it and we see, did it work? You know, sometimes our interventions work, sometimes they need to be changed, and sometimes they need to be abandoned because they just didn't pan out the way that we wanted them to. So yeah, this just gives you kind of a quick way, and this could take anywhere from a month to 4 years to get through this process. I mentioned this just briefly, individual versus case issues. I'd just like to bring Melissa in because she worked as an advocate on behalf of individual women and talk about the experience that she had early on complaining about individual practitioners and how successful that was.
So, Scott, essentially what you're asking me to talk about my bad advocacy.
Well, exactly. You know?
Right? Thank you for that introduction to my bad advocacy. Well, I think part of it, though, is that when I started this work as an advocate in the late 90s and then became the advocate supervisor of all the advocates in our agency, part of what I now know I was doing and facilitating was that, for example, advocates would meet with a battered woman, talk about the police response, the prosecution response, or some sort of intervening agency's response, talk about a particular practitioner, and while they were talking about that particular practitioner, really, you know, complaining about them in the response, they should have done this. And so I was addressing those and dealing with those individually with the individual advocate and the individual, say, police officer or prosecutor. And I tell this story now because one of those prosecutors is my friend now. So we joke about this, but you know, we weren't friends at the time. But I remember a time where a woman really wanted the man who had abused her for years, who had battered her, to have a particular sentence. So this is dealing with the prosecutor at the time. And it was really, really important, a certain part that she wanted, and it didn't happen. And so she was really upset about it. I was really upset about it. So I sent this scathing email to her and put it in writing, and I CC'd her supervisor. And now remember, I'm not saying this is good advocacy, right? So, and then I remember doing it another time with a police officer who had done something. And at that time, then, we had an advocate who was married to a police officer, and so her husband had stopped by. Jeff is his first name, and Jeff said, "So, Melissa, I'm wondering if you realize the power and the implications and impact of when you write a letter to an officer and CC their supervisor, and what that really does." And I said, "No, but I'm guessing you're going to tell me." Well, in part of that department and a part of that union contract and part of their disciplinary procedures in that department in particular, that letter, if it had some sort of accusation that they could validate even a little bit, it was going to end up in his personnel file. And so if he was going to leave that police department and go to another, many of them asked for them to sign a release for the previous case file. And so it had all these implications. So that was just one piece that I didn't realize. But more importantly, what I, of course, realize now, and it wasn't until I went to one of my very first trainings on doing a coordinated community response, that part of what we needed to get away from is, we were just destroying our relationships, but thinking we were the good advocates, speaking on behalf of the cause of individual battered women. But what we realized is that we wanted to think about, so it doesn't matter if Jeff is the police officer or Lori's the prosecutor, who it is in that position, how are we going to look at and organize that position to take up the issue of battering and have victim safety and autonomy be centralized? And part of that for us, what I realized early on is that when I became the CCR coordinator, one of the things that Ellen had mentored me in, and it still stays with me, is that I can't go into any institution as a system advocate or CCR coordinator and just think I know how their work is done. And so part of what she always just sort of fostered and mentored with us here, which I think has been really effective, is that if we want to, for example, go to the police department and say, we want you to, change this thing, that before we even think about doing that, we need to learn their work and the conditions under which they work in. So I have spent many a night, doing police ride-alongs on various shifts and various times. I spent a day with a prosecutor during one of their busiest days and just learned the prosecutor's work. And so I just asked them a lot of questions about the details and really saw how their work was organized so that I had a better understanding of their work, first of all, but also some credibility because I was really taking the time to understand their work. And so that was really, really important to them as practitioners, and I know now that that was effective. And I mean, just so to take the time and don't just do the police ride-alongs, during your day shift time of work, and do them at night. And sometimes there's a lot of action, and I'll never forget the time there was no action except for the last half hour. We pulled over someone for speeding, and I was all just kind of getting like, are we going to have any action here? And then the speeding ticket to this person, and once on my way home, I got a speeding ticket from a different department. But anyway, so we interact with agencies in different ways, but we really have to just take this idea that we have to be learners. That you come into this institution, I mean, the people who work there have had in most cases extensive training, a lot of education. So we can't just think we can go to this large institution and just think that we get to tell them how to do their work differently. And so we've learned the hard way over time. We have lots of stories about, advocacy we'd never do again. And so it's really just sort of helped me understand and think about this. But also it was really important, and we kind of learned this over time, is that it's very difficult to be the CCR coordinator and still be doing individual advocacy with battered women. Individual advocacy is, and if there's advocates on the line, which I know there are, I mean, I just think that advocates are some of the hardest working, least respected, but they're deserving of respect, people in this field. And so to sit with battered women every day in a room and to just, be witness to and be a part of hearing what's happened, it's been very, very difficult to go from that for anyone. To go from that, let's say you meet with a battered woman in the morning, say from 10 a.m. till noon, and then you have a 1 o'clock meeting. I mean, it can be very, very difficult to not carry that pain and that trauma and that experience into you. So inevitably what you're going to end up doing is when you're talking to practitioners or you're at a meeting, you're going to have tone in your voice. You're going to give off a whole lot of judgment. And so it doesn't create a space where then practitioners are going to be open to changing some of their work. And so it takes a really skilled person to be able to do both. And I know it's a resource problem, but we also have to be aware of when we're doing that, we're having a lot of tone and judgment.
Okay, so thank you, Melissa. And she just kind of led into our next slide, which is the role of advocacy in CCR work. So just to build a little bit on what Melissa was saying, we advocates, we have this tendency to want to separate the world into two groups, those who get it and those who don't. And then we get kind of attitude about the fact that because we so well understand the experience of victims, that people should listen to us because of that. And as Melissa said, law enforcement, prosecutors, probation agents, they know a lot too. And if we get together and cooperatively and try to work in concert, the possibilities are endless. But the judgment that comes in, if you're in a CCR meeting like I've been in, and an advocate feels the need to say, I can't believe that just came out of your mouth, that really shuts the meeting down. It doesn't give a lot of incentive for other practitioners to want to come to the meeting and open up their policies and open up their practices and say, this is what we do, if they don't trust the fact that you're going to work with them to try and figure this out, and as opposed to outing them for the mistakes that they end up making. So, when I go to a community and I see a big table of a coordinating council, and there's one advocate at the table, I mean, that group of people is already starting at a deficit. We advocates have to really step up and be part of those processes. Systems need to understand what they can bring, and then we as advocates have to bring it, and really got to check the judgment at the door. And as Melissa said, if you're working with a woman who's been beaten, and then you got to go in and listen to somebody talk about why do these women keep picking, guys to beat them up, those kind of statements can be a trigger, and you could shut the meeting down. And really, what Ellen said about that anger piece, that when you face the amount of injustice that these women often end up doing, or these victims often do, is that don't try to win a moment by telling somebody off, because what you're doing is you're making it harder for the system to respond in a better way down the line for all women, because you're losing the partnerships that are possible. So, all right, research. It's something that Duluth has done for quite some time. Most of what we do are evaluations as opposed to formal research, but there has been formal research that's been done, and I'll go through that in a minute. The first one was the piece that I talked about earlier with the police department on mandatory arrest and tracking recidivism for mandatory arrest versus separate, mediate, non-arrest responses. If you want more of an overview of some of the research that's been done or evaluations, you can go to that link on your page, which is on our website. The first 5-year study on recidivism in the U.S. was done in Duluth. The recidivism ended up being about 40%. There were 100 people involved in that. It was looking at the coordinated community response. Jail was really not used at all, as you can see on that third bullet. Only 9 of the 100 were ordered to do any jail time. It was just not part of what we had developed at the time. And then you see the men's program there. At that time, our men's program was in its infancy, and we were trying to figure out what the best way to do this was. And what we had come up with first, actually, before this, was Batterers Anonymous, where somebody who was a batterer to his partner was running it, and guys would be ordered to go to this once a week, like Alcoholics Anonymous. The problem is that the guy who's running the show reoffended, so that didn't work very well. And then what we did is we partnered with mental health agencies and said that the guys have to go to 11 therapy sessions and 11 education sessions with using the work that we had developed here, or eventually would develop. And then what we ended up moving towards is all education classes, partly because the therapists, when they were doing their own therapy and finding it really difficult to do with this particular population of men who didn't want to go, and they were used to working with people who were looking for help, and they started using the curriculum that we were putting together, and found it much easier to work with these guys because it gave direction, it gave a way to get a conversation going with these guys, and so eventually it became all education programs or classes. The next one was on a domestic violence response team back in the 90s that was developed here in Duluth. We still have one, and that's that response I was talking about with the advocates who go to the police department with 2 investigators who will do nothing but domestic violence, and then bring in probation in that response also. And they basically look to see if within probation specifically, if probation had risk information and was able to determine who the high and low risk guys were and base their sentencing recommendations on that, did it impact recidivism? And it did to some extent. So overall the study findings suggest that improved coordination through the sharing of risk information among criminal justice professionals can reduce recidivism among men who abuse their partners. We have a different response now that how we work with risk, but at the time that was one of the first ones in the country, and it was using a lot of Jackie Campbell's work that she did in 1995 and published. And then the ongoing evaluation of Duluth's, recidivism. So we have this database that I told you about with cases that go back to the late 90s. So we have thousands of cases. We could tell you every hearing they had in a particular case, every judge that was assigned, every, the prosecutor, what decisions were made, what the plea agreements were, what the conviction was, what the sentence was for all of these cases. And so what we did in the early 2000s was take cases from 98 and 99, through 353 of them, and look at how many of those men had committed a new offense within 8 years of their last point of contact, which was typically the men's nonviolence program. So we used their last class date, whether it was a completion or not. They could have went to one class, and that rate was 29% for that group of men at that particular time. We just did it again because we've had enough time between the two. Again, there were 326, 34% was the overall recidivism. But this time we asked the question about if there was a way to distinguish the impact to some extent of the men's program within the CCR. And that's a really difficult question to answer, and researchers struggle to answer that one too, because every point of the intervention on a particular offender may have an impact on his decision to recidivate. So what that collective or cumulative effect is hard to control for. But these are just numbers. These aren't, we didn't pick a certain group other than everybody within this 2-year period. And these are just what the numbers say. 29% recidivism for men who completed the class, and 41% for men who did not, which as an overall made 34%. So, people will talk about whether, the Duluth model works or not, and hopefully now you have some information that they're actually not researching the model. They're probably researching a curriculum that was bought by a particular community without a coordinated community response, and they're actually evaluating whether or not those facilitators in that community using our curriculum had an effect on recidivism. And, if that's the way it was stated, we have nothing to complain about. But what they're actually saying is that the model that we use, the way we coordinate our community's response is what's not working. And it just shows that they haven't done the due diligence to find out what it is they're talking about. And I can tell you that we've had one researcher, Rob Butters, who's doing some research in Idaho, who called us, who wanted to come to our training, who brought us out to the community he's working in to do training. I have a ton of respect for that. But he's the only one. Everybody else writes about us, but they don't talk to us. So they misstate what our response is, what we're about, what our focus is. So let's move to the Men's Nonviolence Program. It's a component of the Duluth Coordinated Community Response. So it's no more important than the law enforcement response. So again, you just take this notion. If somebody came to us and said, can we have your police policy? We want to replicate that in our community, hometown USA. We'd say, okay, well, you can do that, but my guess is that if that's the only agency that changes, that you're probably not going to have the kind of impact that we're seeing here, given this whole coordinated response that we've developed using this particular model. But that's what people do with our curriculum. They buy the curriculum, they stick it someplace, and they expect the same kind of results we have here. Well, it's not going to be the same. So the men's program is a formal partner within the community, with community advocacy programs. We share information back and forth together. We are an education program. We are not a medical facility. We have no HIPAA stipulations to the information. We tell the men what information will be kept in confidence and what information will not. Has access to all law enforcement reports, OFPs, risk analysis. All that stuff comes to the Men's Nonviolence Program. So we have access to it. We can follow it. We can understand who we're working with and how dangerous they might be. Probation receives bi-weekly reports from us on the status of a, so each agent that's supervising a group of men who are going through our program gets a separate report for just the men that they're supervising, telling them what their status is. Are they completed? Are they suspended? Are they suspended for non-payment? Are they suspended due to absences? So that they can supervise these guys on their end. We meet all the same, the men's program meets all the same principles that we talked about earlier that the Duluth Model asks. And then we provide classes for court-ordered men and women and support and education groups for female victims. And we're part of a social movement. We learn this work and partner with women's advocates and victims of battering to develop the curriculum initially. That's who informed the layout, the topics that we cover in the curriculum. It's based in women's lived experience. It's organized to provide safety for women first and change for men second. We don't prioritize his change over her safety ever. It changes what we do. It changes how we think about the work. And then, as I've said, it's a component of the loose coordinated response. So just thinking about the social change piece, the difference. The example I was thinking of recently is in Duluth, we have a volunteer attorney program. And so an attorney will show up on a particular day at the courthouse, and people who are mostly poor will come in and look for advice from an attorney on a particular legal question that they have. Okay? So it's a service that's being provided. The Southern Poverty Law Center does that. They provide a service for people who are poor and need legal services, but they also advocate and work to change the social conditions that create the poverty in the first place. That's a social change organization versus a service delivery program. And so our Men's Nonviolence Program positions itself within a social movement to end the battering violence. We create experiences that are liberating rather than dominating. So, so let's take the topic of emotional abuse, for example. We could, we know what emotional abuse is. We should have a version of it. We could walk into a men's group and try to teach these men and ingrain our understanding of emotional abuse into them, and then talk to them what respect is, and tell them what it is and how their lives would be better if they knew this. But that second one about engaging in dialogue versus counsel and advice, we start with their version of it. So we go into the room, we ask them, when you're emotionally abusive to your partner, first, what is it to you? And then what are examples of when you do it? What do you do? Call her names. Tell her she's fat. Tell her that she's a bitch. Tell her she's a bad mother. Diminish her this way, that, all these different ways. We put all that stuff on the board. And then what's your intent? Why do you do it? Because I want to punish her. I had a guy last night saying that, he said a lot of nasty stuff to her. I said, why? What was the intent? Make her pay. Like, she's talking to me about stuff that I don't think she should be talking to me about. So if you're going to talk to me that way, then this is what you're going to get, right? This is my way of punishing you and not going to jail. So, so then what's the belief that you have that says that when your partner, the woman that you've married to, the mother of the children that you both share, when she doesn't, want to talk to you, that you get to put holes in the wall, call her a cunt, a whore, a bitch, scare her, do all of that stuff, what says that that's what you get to do? You know, how do you justify that? Because she doesn't get to ignore me. Okay, so she doesn't get to ignore you. What else? Well, if she does, she's going to pay for it. Okay, now that's thinking. That's a belief that he has that's driving that behavior. Now, this guy knows this is how it gets, you know, created in his head that he gets to be abusive in this particular way. And then we work with that. So what's the effect on her when you do it? What's the effect on you when you do it? What's the effect on your children when they see it, right? And then it's all their stuff. It's not our lecture. It's their lives. So, you know, at the end of the night, when the board's full, it's full of their life as men. This is what they create when they're emotionally abusive. And that's that dialogical piece where they end up owning it in a different way and in a deeper way than if we were lecturing them and trying to convince them that being emotionally abusive is a bad thing, or convince them that respect is what they should be doing with their partners. These are the principles. I'm not going to go through in detail on all these. You can read what they are. I think they're self-explanatory. We've covered a lot of them up to this point. So men's programs, kind of the direction that they go, because I train hundreds of people over the years who do these programs, and went to countless communities in states all over the country, and look at the programs that they've set up, and a lot of them are standalone agencies. They're not part of the response, or they really resist being part of the response because they don't see the benefit for themselves. They got overhead, right? They've set them up like a business model, so they've got a boatload of overhead that we don't have because we've set it up as a community-based program as opposed to a business program. So a community-based program, we pay $50 to a facilitator each group that they do. We have 2 facilitators. That's $100. We collect $5, $10, and $15 and $20, up to $20 per class for the guys. Average amount we collect is probably around 10. We're not trying to make money. We're just trying to cover the expense of the program. We got the room, we got the heat, that piece. We run about 250 men a year through the program for about $45,000. So we can keep the cost to the men who are mostly poor down, right? Because we're not trying to make it worse for them and their families. And it frees us up to do a lot of the CCR work and participate in the social change work in the community. And so, the benefit to a men's program of being part of a CCR. Here's an example. I got a call from Illinois asking, so one of the criticisms about your men's program is that it doesn't take up chemical dependency. There's nothing in your book that talks about how we should be checking for sobriety, what you should do when you find somebody's been using, that kind of thing. And I look at state regulations when it comes to men's programs, and I'm just like shocked at the amount of responsibility that gets shoved on the men's programs to do endless assessments, track these guys' use, treat them for alcohol, treat them for the violence that they're doing. In Duluth, we know in our response that the best agency position to deal with chemical dependency is probation. They assess for it. They can. They have the best leverage to get the guy to do it, and they take care of it. The only thing we'll do in that regard is if they come in high, we'll report that to probation, and they'll deal with it from there. But probation is really where we set that whole response. And what probation has done is they go a step beyond that, They picked the top 10 highest risk men for that particular week because, as we all know, risk is dynamic. And they'll go out and find these guys. 2 probation agents will go out, they'll find them, they'll PBT them, they'll give them a breathalyzer. When the program first started, 25% of the guys were being arrested for use violations for the most part. And with 6 months after it started, the word got out and it was down to 10%. So that, there's no way a men's program could do a monitoring intervention like probation can do. We don't have the leverage, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the expertise. That's not our work. That's theirs. And they've executed extremely well. And now we've got a lot more sober, dangerous guys. And if you know the risk, like one study showed, 8 to 11 times more likely to batter on the day that he's been drinking. Okay, we need to keep these guys sober because it's linked to safety. So, you know, there's a reason to invest your time in the CCR because a lot of what gets dumped on men's programs can be taken off and put in the agencies that are better positioned to deal with the problems. So that's, you know, I think we've got about 1 minute left. I thank you all for joining this webinar. I hope that you have a better understanding of when you hear what the phrase the Duluth model bantered around, that you actually know what it is that it really is here in Duluth versus how it's being talked about in whatever publication that you're seeing, and encourage you to call. We have a training coming up May 17th to the 20th in 2016 on how to work on a coordinated community response. I should say one thing. You know, you go to, there's a lot of conferences that are out there that talk about individual interventions, kind of the shiny new object, but they don't tell you how to organize them. And what a coordinated community response training does is tells you not only about what we've organized, but how you organize it. And I really think it's, you know, as audience members, we need to hold presenters to the task of not just talking about how great the intervention that they created is, but how did you organize it? And what do you need to have in place to make this work? Because if you take that great intervention back to your community that doesn't have 3 things that you need in place in order for it to work, but nobody told you that, then you implement it, it doesn't work, and then you think that somebody lied to you, when in fact, you just didn't have the infrastructure that they had to set it up. So, yeah, give it, you know, you can call us, you can contact us with questions, and again, we're glad that you all were able to join us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Scott. So all of you will receive an email at the conclusion of this with feedback that we hope to get from you, and also you'll receive a link with the materials from this webinar that'll have the PowerPoint and the handouts. I know that some of those handouts are big, and but you will receive that in the next few days. So thank you again. We look forward to having you in one of our next webinars. Essentially what we're going to be doing, this is the overview one. So we're going to talk about how to implement each of these components in one of our future webinars, and then we're going to be having 2 of the lead researchers on basically men's nonviolence programs be on a webinar in the future as well. So thank you for your time and have a great day.